3 months ago, I shared my dad's eulogy with you all as we prepared for his memorial service. On February 2nd, I stood up at the church podium and delivered that speech at the church. The theme was listening through the static, and my dad's life as a mild mannered, dutiful Clark Kent. Over the last 2 or 3 months, I've practiced that lesson of listening through the static, listening through the grief, the stress, the volatile emotions, and listening through the flurry of activity that comes with losing a loved one, and then very quickly having to organize an event in their honor. It really, as I listened that day to my dad, three things stood out. First, my dad, Mark Joseph Roy, was not a very aspirational guy. He's told me about how he didn't try very hard in school. He downplayed his Eagle Scout project as being unimpressive. He told me one story just in the last few years about working in the communications department of UConn, which here means the University of Connecticut. The workday was 7:30 to 3:30, and he often worked a little late until 5 p.m. or even later. One day, for whatever reason, he had to leave on time at 3:30. As he was walking out the door, his boss saw him and said, leaving early today, eh, Mark? He never worked past 3:30 again. He said if he wasn't going to be appreciated, then why bother? He did his job and he did it well. He wasn't aspirational, but man, did he do a lot in his life. He was an Eagle Scout and then achieved Order of the Arrow, which is the next level above Eagle Scout. He got a national award for being an outstanding young man. He was invited to write and publish a book about the history of Yukon. I heard so many stories about his excellence in radio as a news reporter. He also voiceovered for several documentaries that the university had put together, and he was also the MC for commencement for at least a decade. As I heard people tell these stories of all the awesome things that he'd done, I realized just how much you can do by being patient and putting drops in the bucket. I was reminded of a quote by Martin Luther King Jr. If a man is called to be a street sweeper, he should sweep streets even as Michelangelo painted, or Beethoven composed music, or Shakespeare wrote poetry. He should sweep streets so well that all the host of heaven and earth will pause to say, here lived a great street sweeper who did his job well. Just by doing his job well, no more, no less, my dad left a wonderful impact on so many lives. Second lesson, as letters and cards and messages came in after my dad passed, as the stories were told on that day of his memorial, one phrase kept being said again and again. He was such a nice guy. 150 people showed up to his memorial. Now, I've been to services where I thought there would be a lot of people. My dad was quiet, not overly aspirational, introverted, and I didn't know how many people were realistically going to show up. But my dad was kind. He was such a nice guy that people came who knew him from church, from his decades working at UConn, from his time in the 1970s and 80s as a radio announcer. His college friends came, high school friends, elementary school friends. The whole timeline of his life was represented because he was just such a nice guy. Lesson one, be patient. Drops in the bucket. Lesson two, be kind, be nice, and people will be there for you. And then finally, lesson number 3. It was so fun to hear everyone mention the same things about my dad. Everyone knew exactly who he was, his hobbies, and the passions that drive him, that inspired him, that made him uniquely himself. Everyone mentioned his love of Superman, as I did in my speech. My cousin Wally got up to speak a few words before me and had the same basic theme because my dad was thematic. Wally talked about my dad's accomplishments in scouting and how they made him a real life Superman. While my speech was more about him being like Clark Kent, I also tied in his scouting. And Wally and I both had the same basic message because it was easy to know exactly who my dad was, what he believed in, and what he held dear. The Beatles came up a ton in people's stories and memories. And of course, my dad's passion for UConn, for the university. We received a letter, a memo that was sent by the current interim vice president of communications at UConn to the staff, letting them know about my dad's passing. In it, he said, "It's safe to say that Mark probably forgot more about UConn than most of us will ever know." In this memo, he told a brief story to highlight it. Quote, "A reporter once asked me for a dark piece of UConn trivia, and the question totally stumped me. It was the kind of thing you'd have to spend weeks going through newspaper archives to find. So I just asked Mark if he knew. He replied instantly and off the top of his head and recited long forgotten names and dates associated with the events that at that point had happened 40 years earlier, which I had never heard before." My dad loved the things he loved. His knowledge and passion for them was inspiring. Here lived a great street sweeper who knew his trivia well. My favorite part of that memo was the ending paragraph, and it perfectly summarizes this third lesson. But my single most distinct memory of Mark doesn't really have to do anything with the work he did. Mark loved the Beatles, and he was a character in the best sense of the word. If you were here prior to 2007, then you had the misfortune of working in the dreary, forlorn, now vanished publications building. But Mark was anything but dreary. If you walked by his office often enough, he was over almost all by himself in the back of the building, then there was a pretty good chance that at least once you heard him blaring a Beatles record at top volume while sitting at his desk joyfully, unabashedly singing along to every song. It was impossible not to smile. Be patient, be kind, be passionate, and do the right thing, just like Clark Kent.